Hi all. There is a very interesting game that occurred recently between two mega champions, Magnus Carlsen, of course, the current world chess champion, and Vishy Anand playing with the black pieces. So this is at the Gashimov Memorial, round 2. Let's have a look at this game. D4 from Magnus. We see knight f6, c4, e6, and Magnus avoids potential Nimzo-Indian variations by playing this, the Queen's Indian at the moment. It transposes into a Queen's Gambit declined with bishop f4. So 5 bishop f4. The usual move in the past was bishop g5 pretty routinely. So for example h6, bishop dropping back. This kind of position, black tries to sort out the c8 bishop, putting it there, and it's thought to be about equal, this position. So bishop f4 has a bit of spice to it after black castles e3. If black plays the routine move knight bd7, then c5 has been in vogue in recent years at the super grandmaster level, giving white a kind of interesting imbalance, trying to lock down the e5 break from black whilst having a queenside space advantage. And for example, this position is annoying to black. If black's taking there, white can accept double pawns as an example with an edge there. So it can be quite dangerous, this c5 from white. So black plays c5, and it looks as though isn't black kind of equalizing after d takes. Bishop takes c5 is played. Before we check out bishop takes c5, if d takes c4, just to try and keep the symmetrical pawn structure, highly symmetrical pawn structure, but it seems here, there are some concerns even in this position with the c8 bishop getting out. So for example, if the bishop has to go there, knight d2 turns out to be pretty strong, to be playing knight e4 hitting c5. So this is pretty dangerous. White's winning that d7 bishop there if that's a totally disastrous play from black. But if bishop e7 instead, here it seems as though white's getting a significant edge here. So black has to be careful not to kind of play d takes c4. It seems so. Bishop takes c5, queen c2, knight c6. Here again, if d takes c4, it seems as though white does get something potentially from this position. It looks as though e4 here with the c8 bishop undeveloped. White's getting a significant edge. So there is some venom to the setup. Knight c6, a3. We have queen a5. Here, if black had played d4 immediately, white could actually castle queenside. So that pressure on d4, this is just desperate. That's winning material. So this is just horrible after castling queenside. So black really can't play d4. So queen a5, rook d1. So that is actually potentially threatening b4. b4 wasn't playable here because of just bishop takes that pinned pawn. So rook d1, rook d8. But no, even here, this is too dangerous to play because of the king in the center taking. There's basically lines. It's really, really dangerous. It's kind of well known actually that you can't play b4 here, I believe. So bishop e2, knight e4. If d4 is played here, e takes, knight takes, bishop takes, white castles, and this is okay. This is actually very nice for white after b4 here, with the idea of knight b5 forking queen and bishop. So this position, bang, bishop takes e5 because of that pin against the rook, and white's getting a big advantage there. So black has to be quite careful here. Knight e4, c takes, knight takes, b takes, e takes, white castles. Now if we look at this structurally, okay, black's freed up the bishop, that's not such a problem it seems, but has the isolated queen's pawn. That could turn out to be a problem, but hasn't white also got fragmented pawns? So overall, shouldn't it be equal? It seems there's structural damage on both sides here. Black played h6. One thing which the knight's departure taking on c3 to cause this, it has potentially meant that this soft spot, which the queen is eyeing, there might actually be crude moves like knight g5 to tease some more weaknesses out. So h6 kind of prevents knight g5 in some variations. By the way, if black had played queen takes, then rook a1 traps the queen. And bishop takes is also ridiculous because it's a self-pin. And then knight g5 and queen b3, that's going to be really quite accurate. Yeah, there's nothing black's doing there. So h6 seems sensible to stop knight g5. There's a fun line here actually with bishop f8. Might as well show you. Knight g5, g6, c4 is really dangerous. In this position, say h6, then bang, knight takes f7, c takes. This is super dangerous for black. Bishop c7, for example. You can see a lot of dangers. So h6 does seem a very good move to play. a4, bishop d6. You might think, well, why the exchange of the dark square bishops? Well, if bishop f8, yes, it seems as though white could get something, a very comfortable blockading position on the dark squares. Whether it's winning, absolutely, that's because is another matter. So that's exposing an attack on the rook, so the rook moves back as an example. White does have an annoying edge. So this pursuit of simplification to avoid this kind of torturous scenario seems justifiable. It does seem an odd place for the queens in this example variation. But yeah, I mean, if you look, basically white is more comfortable overall. With the structural damage, it's actually also, though, the c3 pawn acts as a nice support for that knight. There's prevention of b5 here. White could potentially, build up on d5 with things like bishop f3 and maybe rook d1. So I think overall it's more torturous for black. So bishop d6 tries to get any excitement out of the position. Magnus obliges, rook takes, and now c4. He is able to play c4 with that pin on d6, bishop e6, and now this would just be a draw. I believe c takes would be a stone cold, nothing to play for draw here, because this isn't a real threat to b7, rook d8, because there's always knight d4 if rook takes b7. Let's put that on the board. Knight d4 hits the queen and the rook. So given that's the case, if white does this, then they can agree a draw here. But Magnus presses on with c5, so that move 18. And you might think, as I did, I went through the game twice actually, just to make sure I wasn't missing anything mega exciting. I'm curious about Super Grandmaster Play, so I thought I'd share any insights I had about this game. And okay, white has a kind of bind. I mean, it's evident that white has a nice bind, especially on d4. The question is it enough? And also with this pawn now eyeing b6 and d6, there is a very nice move white's about to play, which kind of reflects the dark square bind. The queen goes away from hitting c5 there. If b6, this can lead to trouble with the queen there. Well, this just c takes with queen takes c6. So the queen is not just getting out of any problems with tempo gains. It's protecting c6 in preparation for dissolving this c5 pawn. Okay, fine, but queen b2 is the nice move. It keeps an eye, a lock and key on the d pawn, puts pressure on b7. Now after rook a b8, knight d4 is played, and there might be some ideas of, well, taking might be an idea as well. That's like in a Fischer-Spassky game in 1972 where Fischer took and then played e4, disrupting the black pawn structure. That's a legitimate idea. Knight takes and e4 will be disruptive to black's pawn structure. Let me just put that on the board actually, improvising here. I hope this is not going to be silly, but e4 I think is possible. I believe this is possible anyway. So that kind of thing is avoided anyway. Black just took on d4, and you must think, well, you might think, let's go back. After knight d4, what is white's advantage here after queen takes? Surely it's minuscule. there's absolutely nothing to play for, surely, especially if black's dissolving the c5 pawn, which is kind of an aggressive pawn, with b6. Surely there's nothing here. Also, I mean, you could argue, I mean, a6, bishop f3, okay, white's got an annoying edge. So maybe, you know, black wants to dissolve that c5 pawn. And mission accomplished, c takes, rook takes, h3, gives some air for the king. That's good to avoid any back row weaknesses. Rook c8, rook fd1, and here Vishy plays queen c3, so getting the queens off. So surely there's nothing to play for here. If rook c6, that might be safer actually, just keeping a control of that c file. For example, like this, it would seem, well, standing guard like this, maybe this is a small edge for white. Structurally, it looks good. Yeah, there's some play there for white. Okay, so queen c3, understandable. Takes. a5 is played. On rook takes, we're really, aren't we, just going into dust here? Because there's the annoying, you know, rook a3 hitting a4. So if that's the case, this b6 is not really an exploitable target. So are we going to dust scenarios? Well, okay, rook takes b1, rook takes b1. It seems to be approaching dust. The interesting thing, in fact, the most interesting thing I discovered about this game, you could say factually, is there seems to be three mistakes in a row here. So from both sides, it seems this next move is a definite mistake from a computer perspective. So this next move looks kind of, okay, logical to hit the a5 pawn. It turns out black needs to play very precisely here. So this is one of the three, it seems, critical mistakes from an engine perspective. Black needs to play rook c7, so it looks to be, you know, guarding the b7 entry point as the top priority. And for example, with a6, now bishop c8, so guarding that entry point would seem to be the top priority. And could white make headway here? It seems difficult. And another way of doing this is bishop c8 to guard b7. And again, it seems as though this is going to be very difficult for white to make headway here. However, yeah, fascinatingly, you could say rook c5 is a mistake, and Magnus responded with a6, which is an inaccuracy, it seems, from an engine perspective. So rook b8 check, it seems, guarantees a significant edge by playing the rook check first. Then a6. There's it makes it makes a big difference here. So, for example, well, g6, rook b7. Yeah, I mean the let's just have a look. Yeah, rook c2. There's bishop b5. So a7, once a7's won, this is a very dangerous passed pawn, so this would be a big advantage to white. So that's the principal variation. It seems as though white, by force, is gaining a big advantage with rook b8 check. So this is odd. I mean, this is slightly odd to consider. Yeah, just from a technical perspective, it seems, you know, there's also rook a8 to consider, perhaps. If bishop c8, that's the difference. You know, there's differences here from before. The a7 is living on borrowed time here. That a7 pawn. So a6 though immediately. Yeah, there does seem to be two ways. This seems to be an absolutely critical mistake to play g6. So the two ways of guarding the entry point here: bishop c8 or rook c7. Both of which seem to be very hard to crack. For bishop c8, let's just put this on the board. It seems as though black should be okay. There's no big problem there. Or rook b7. I mean, we could play it. If rook b7, sorry, let's just check this out as well. If white tried to play this tactic rook b7, this doesn't work because black just throws in this check and then gets behind the pawn. That doesn't work. So there doesn't seem to be any way to actually break this down. Yeah, it just seems this should be fine for black. However, with g6, we are getting this scenario where the a7 pawn is in big trouble. Check, king h2, rook c2. We have bishop b5. White is prepared to drop f2 for that a7 because that is a huge passed pawn. And in fact, here now, king g3 even protects f2. So now, white is threatening things like bishop f1 without rook takes f2. So just to put this, this is the most accurate king g3 to protect f2. If bishop f1 had been played, rook takes f2. Then here, rook takes a7 is apparently just a small edge, but this is making the most out of the position. King g3 with bishop f1 now as a threat. So bishop c8 was played. We have now rook b8, king g7, rook takes, and you might think, well, isn't this just a rook and pawn ending? Not quite. This extra pawn is actually, it seems, winning technically in this position. Let's see the continuation. So a7, the pawn goes to a7, and there's no time to take on f2 because the rook's just moving and then queening. So here, this stops the king from entering the position. And after g3, this enables the white king to start moving after g3. And actually the game ended here. So just to demonstrate why this particular rook and pawn ending position is winning, I'll give you a fictional scenario. Say the king makes a journey basically over here to b1 and then starts going up the board and en route hits d5. So the isolated pawn is a major problem in this scenario, for example. And if the king had been around, there's always a check to queen the pawn. So this kind of scenario, once d5 is picked off, this is going to be absolutely winning. There's going to be an extra passed pawn here. It's going to be absolutely miserable for black, and it's technically winning. Okay, so this is not the most, maybe you could say this is not the most mega exciting game, but it's interesting, even in these simplified positions, even the absolute strongest grandmasters in the world played inaccuracy. When the advantages are tiny, it seems the need for precision and less complacency sort of goes up. And funny enough, yeah, there were 3 critical mistakes in this game. So maybe it should have been a draw, but Magnus managed to get something out of it, despite missing the most accurate line initially. So yeah, fascinating, but that's the nature of human chess. So yeah, okay, I hope you got something from it. If you enjoyed this game video, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on the variations of this and other game videos from the improved menu puzzle books option at Chess World, which has also a link to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much.